where ADHD really tends to hurt people is in their performance, because it's really measurable. In fact, like if you look at what diagnosis tests or screening tests, they're always focused about like kind of the way that it's reflected in achievements, right? Like a big one is academic performance. Trying to look at shame less so about a feeling, like what I find works for people is to think about it less as a feeling and to think about more about what shame is as a behavior.
Hey there, Vibers. Welcome to the Vibe with Kai podcast, where we keep it real, we keep it relatable, and we keep it a little bit funny as we dive into all things mental health, ADHD, and introversion. My name is Kai. I'm your host, and each week we're going to tackle life struggles with honesty, humor, and a whole lot of heart. So whether you're here for practical advice or a little validation or just a laugh about what life is like as an adult in today's world, listen, you are in the right place. We are not about toxic positivity here. We are all about being genuine to each other and to ourselves. And we're talking about real things. And we want to encourage each other and remind you that you are not alone. With that said, my friends, sit back, relax, and let's vibe through this together and enjoy today's episode of the Vibe with Kai podcast.
What up, Vibers? Welcome back. It's your boy, Kai. Welcome back to the Vibe with Kai podcast. We have returning guests here, Justin Leff. Last time Justin was here, we had a huge response to our convo about ADHD being a quote superpower or not. I thought that was a really interesting response that we got. Some of you agreed, some of you strongly disagreed, and a whole lot of you had like these mixed feelings. So today, I want to keep that conversation going. Justin and I had the same thought about talking about this topic. So I'm glad to have him back. We're diving into the big question: how much of who you are is shaped by ADHD? Does it define us, or is it just one piece of the puzzle? Today, we're going to break it all down. No sugarcoating, all real talk. Let's get into it. Justin, welcome back. Thanks for coming back, man.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I think we both saw that response and went, okay, this would be fun to talk about. So,
absolutely. Yeah, we're definitely going to get into that. We're definitely going to get a lot and that's one of the reasons why I love posting the clips from the podcast onto my social channels, because it kind of starts this conversation, and it's kind of like a thought piece, and it has this really cool ability for you to respond to what people are saying. So that's really cool. Yeah, so we saw the big topic in that clip was regarding ADHD superpowers, right? What stood out to you from that? Was that surprising to you when that clip went out and there was such a big response to that specific clip? Did that surprise you at all?
It did and it didn't, because like, I know that's a really popular opinion, but I think a lot of us, and I'm definitely guilty of this, but maybe more than the average person, I'm just being a little bit arrogant, thinking, oh, I explained it so well, who could possibly disagree with me?
Sure.
But you always think that you're translating messages perfectly in your head. So to me, I think what I thought what I was explaining was clear, but it obviously wasn't, because then people wouldn't be confused, right? That's my responsibility as a communicator. So that was what was interesting to me, is that some of the opinions I felt like were kind of reacting to almost how they responded to it rather than what I think I was trying to say. And again, that's not blaming them. That's a communication challenge that you always have to overcome when you talk about something as complex as identity, right? So that's why I think it's great that we're come back and spending a whole episode on it.
Yeah, and I mean, and honestly, it was really varied. Like there was a lot of people that felt that ADHD gives them unique strengths, but there were others that said that calling it a superpower ignores their struggles, right? How do we balance that perspective? Because I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. I feel like everybody's feelings are valid and legitimate. How do we find a good balance there?
I'm gonna try not to get too complicated here, because this is something that I think doesn't even really have a lot of like good literature on it, and it's something that's very complicated, which is it useful to be a hypocrite? I think that's such an interesting question in psychology, because I think a really good example of this is, I think one of the best attitudes you can have is that, like, politically, you're all about taking care of other people, but when it comes to yourself, you're super individualistic and it's all about me and my responsibility. But that doesn't really work, right? Because you kind of can't have a different opinion for society and then a different opinion for yourself as a member of society.
Sure.
Another good example of this is free will. Like, I'm not a very spiritual person, so I don't know if I believe in free will. I think that our brain's just kind of a big piece of meat that's mind controlling us.
Yeah.
But I think that the concept of free will is so practical that I just believe in it. I believe in my ability to do things freely. So sometimes we kind of lie to ourselves a little bit. And so I think that is something that gives people a lot of value when they call ADHD a superpower sometimes. And maybe that's why they identify with it. Because like, even if we look at ADHD as a disorder, it's kind of hard to see where the superpower is. But if you can kind of frame it in a way where it is a superpower and lie to yourself in a way that's useful, it's not me just permissing self-delusion.
Right.
I think it's literally healthy like thought.
Sure,
right?
sure.
It's a very rich idea, but that's kind of like the thing that I reacted to when people talk about it, because I don't really disagree with it. Like, they're getting value out of it. They're empowering themselves. They're getting confidence out of it. So like, who the hell am I to take that away from you?
Sure.
Right. But on the other hand, when I look at the ADHD symptom list, I'm like, well, I don't see where the strength is here. And so that's a very interesting thing to try and sort out, I think.
Right. Do you think that the way that people frame their ADHD, whether it's as a strength or a disability or just a neutral fact, whatever it may be, do you think that impacts their ability to manage it in either a positive or negative way? I think you were kind of starting to hint at that a little bit, but does it truly impact the way that they manage it in the long run?
Yes. So I think that one of the biggest risks, and one of the reasons people both, take it as a superpower and then also look at it as this demon that they have to fight, is because it's very easy to feel ashamed for having ADHD because of how you look at it as a part of you, right? So it's a really good ability, or this is when psychology and philosophy really blur, which is what is you? Because a lot of people get into these periods of life where they go, I'm not doing, because I work with people that deal with motivation and discipline a lot. And one of the phrases I hear so often is that this isn't me, right? Like, I'm not lazy, I'm not disciplined. It's they think that their body is fighting against them, right? And it's so interesting because what they're deciding is that the part of them that is lazy and not productive isn't them. And the part of them that wants to be is them. And then there are some people that have the opposite problem, where they feel like their laziness defines who they are, right? And that what they are inside doesn't matter. And so there's no right way to do it, and there's no clear way to do it, but we all have the ability to decide what parts of us are us and what parts of us are not. And if the part of you you have ADHD, and that ADHD is getting in the way of all of your goals and your struggles, it's very easy to feel ashamed for dealing with that issue instead of looking at it as this external problem that's between you and your goals.
Right. I think the question that I feel like it is being asked here is if you didn't have ADHD, do you think you'd still be you? It's like it kind of like, because that's what I've been like playing with in my brain. Because I often talk about how my struggles with ADHD, I wouldn't go back in time and like try to diagnose myself earlier, because like the struggles that I've had, not only with ADHD, but with anxiety, depression, OCD, all of those kind of played a role into creating the person that you see today. Yeah. And so it's like, I'd be me regardless, but would I be this version of me if I didn't, if I didn't have those things, or if I went about things differently? So it's like, that's kind of like this existential like thing that I've kind of been playing with. And I'm curious, do you hear that kind of thought processes a lot with the people that you talk with? Is this something that they struggle with or talk about?
Not commonly, but I've definitely brought it up once or twice. Sure. I think maybe not to get too pie in the sky, but it's almost as if, imagine if we could clone the universe 5 different times and then make little edits to you in each version of the universe and then watch them all play out and decide how you feel about each one of them.
That's called kind The Sims, Justin. That's called The Sims. It's a video game created by Electronic Arts. It's a great game. You should try it.
Yeah. I kind of stand by the analogy that I gave last time with poverty. Like, there are some people where it's like, obviously you don't want people to be in poverty, but there are some people where the experiences that transform their life are so defined by their time in poverty that you can't possibly take that away from them. And if you say, let's take away your poverty and put you in a family where you were very wealthy,
right?
On paper, that's good. Like, statistically, we'd predict that would lead to a better life for that person. But if you apply that to yourself and try and rewrite your history that way, you have no idea who you would even be.
Right.
And I'm very much with you. I know that this is kind of looked at as like a cheesy quote that people hang above their kitchen cabinets, but I'm very much about no regrets, right? You just have to understand that your history is a huge part of who you are. Yes. And going back and editing stuff, just, again, you're you're losing yourself in that process, right? You're not, it's very messy. And so, I think that's part of the reason people can have this complicated relationship with, is ADHD a superpower? Because we all have strengths that we want to validate about ourselves, right? I'm creative, I'm successful, I'm hardworking, I'm a good father, I'm a good mother. And so if ADHD is you and you have superpowers, then is ADHD part of the superpower? It's a hard question to answer.
This is I'm still fairly new to the ADHD space. It's only been a couple of years, and like it's funny how like every single day I'm just met with these new questions that I just would have never, like, this stuff would have never crossed my mind. But I appreciate it because it helps me understand me better and what makes me tick. And I appreciate you like bringing this topic up and asking these questions, because like these are things that I think we need, no matter what you feel about it, no matter what your opinion is, I think it's important to still understand how it affects you in whatever way. And one of the comments that stood out to me in that post was from a mom, and she said that ADHD is a superpower that helps kids see their strength. Do you think this kind of framing helps kids, or do you think it kind of sets this unrealistic expectation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm going to make clear that I'm going to speculate here, because for me, I focus on adult ADHD. I'm not, I don't really study too much how it works in children.
Right.
But one thing that I do know is that children obviously are not capable of navigating shame and identity in the same way an adult can. So if you give a child a label and tell them that you have this problem, you need to be very careful about how you do it. And yeah,
it's tough. That's tough. Yeah. And like, I don't want you to feel like you have to answer something that, that's like,
no, I mean, as long as I make clear this opinion, I'm fine talking about anything, but I'm just, it's a hard question, right? Like, do kids, does it let them see their strengths? It might, it might, it's
right.
It's hard to say, because some kids might feel really different and really have to hide about it. And if you push ADHD as a strength to them, that might be the thing that they need to not retreat into a bubble.
Sure.
And so maybe how you look at ADHD, is it a superpower? Is it something that you need to manage? Maybe that needs to change over time as you mature as a person. Right.
And I think even like as what I saw in like the comment section, where there were a lot of adults that said that their ADHD, fuels their creativity. I think you were talking about this earlier as well. It fuels their creativity. It fuels their enthusiasm for life. It fuels their resilience in life. Do you think that ADHD itself creates these traits, or do we just adapt to it in a way that makes us stronger?
I think that ADHD might lead to certain lifestyles that can facilitate that. So like a good example of this might be something that I've heard a lot, I'm guessing you have too, is how people talk about having depression makes them like smarter or more intelligent or more critical. Sure. And that's not what we find in research. That's not a correlation between depression and intelligence. Like, we haven't discovered that yet. However, what does make sense is that if you have a period of depression in your life, you might kind of retreat into hobbies that are more intellectually challenging, right? Like if you were having troubles making friends at school, maybe you stay at home and you become more introverted and you start to read books and you get into all of these materials that open up your mind a little bit, right? So what I think is happening there is that something like ADHD or something like depression can kind of guide you into a certain direction that happens to have resources that promote certain abilities in that way.
Yes,
so if you're
sense.
somebody that if you can't focus and you're looking forward at your path, you don't really think about becoming an engineer. And so you start to embrace things that, like, one good example of this is how I think entrepreneurs are disproportionately ADHD. And that's because being an entrepreneur just supports that, like, it supports your weaknesses a little bit better, right? It's harder to fit into a corporate office. So if you have ADHD and you go, fuck, I can't focus, I can't do what is like expected of me in a corporate environment, I think it might be most appropriate for me to just try and do it on my own, right? Sure. Not even necessarily as a strength, but sometimes just kind of as like a last resort.
Sure.
So having ADHD can push you into certain directions, and there's no question that becoming an entrepreneur leads to different skill sets than doing, a traditional career path. Right. So I think it's more about the correlation than the causation of it, is how I would look at it, based on, because we have studied creativity in ADHD and intelligence and depression, ADHD, and all of these things. And it turns out that it doesn't really lead to these things, but there definitely is a correlation there. And I think that's because of the experiences it pushes you into, rather than a direct effect of having it.
Right. On the other side of this conversation, there were some people in the comments that were calling that were saying that calling ADHD a superpower can feel dismissive, like it ignores the constant daily struggles that we have to deal with. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. Like, I agree. I think that the point that I immediately leap to is that it also just kind of contradicts itself. Like, we can't have pushes to socialize ADHD medication and make accommodations in the workplace and then also say that it's a strength. Like that doesn't really make too much sense to me. Like,
interesting. Yeah.
Can't be, because those two campaigns are happening at the same time. Like there's a lot of effort in trying to normalize ADHD, to create understanding for it, to understand that it's a challenge for people. And at the same time, it makes me a superpower. So why would a society be interested in providing support and facilitating a strength? Right. Like we make social policies around helping people with like disadvantages. Right. So those two messages kind of work against each other for me.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it does feel dismissive. Like, you're like ADHD can cripple your life really severely. Yes. And when you try and express that to somebody and they come back by saying, oh, but it's such it makes you creative and it makes you unique. And it's like, that is dismissing my struggles, right? Because I'm not coming to you telling you that I feel unique and I feel creative. I'm coming to you telling you that I can't sustain action towards the things that matter to me in life. Yeah. And then you go around telling me that it's a superpower.
Right.
Like, that feels dismissive, 100%. I can
One of the comments that stood out to me, like you saying that, and I specifically highlighted this one because I thought it was really interesting. One person said, having a debilitating lack of dopamine isn't a superpower. I thought that was like really, like, it's so interesting, like I guess the spectrum here, because I think there is a wide spectrum, and I think that superpowers, quote unquote, I think they do, I guess, exist on a spectrum. And I guess there's good ones and bad ones for ADHD. And it's really blown my mind, the varied thoughts behind this, because everything you're saying is right. The differentiating opinions in the comments, they're not necessarily wrong. They're not, I mean, there's no right or wrong answer here. Another comment that I want to point out here, it was from a teacher. And she commented that their hyper awareness makes them a great educator, while someone else said that ADHD makes everything harder. And so I guess my question to you, as somebody that helps people with this, at the end of the day, how can ADHDers learn to just simply harness their best traits without minimizing their struggles?
Yeah. Ooh. Sorry, repeat the question. I want to think about it again.
Yeah. So I feel like, because there's so many people that are talking about how, ADHD is a strength or ADHD is a struggle, there's all of that. But at the end of the day, I feel like we can harness ADHD to help us without minimizing our struggle. I just don't know how. I guess that's a tough thing. So how can people at least start the path towards embracing their ADHD and using it to their advantage, while also still not having ADHD be, I guess, traits be considered dismissive or minimizing their struggle?
Yeah, there is one thing I'm going to say. There is one, I think, fairly, because a lot of this comes down to the individual, but there's one thing that I kind of, not you always, but you kind of often go over with clients when it comes to ADHD in terms of what is it a benefit towards.
Sure.
And I think it's that it creates a responsibility to be disciplined. So like a really good example is how many people do you know that start talking about back pain in their 30s, right? And the reason for that is because when you're 20 years old, you have no appreciation for your health whatsoever. It's only when things start getting taken away from us that we really start appreciating them, right? So usually it's kind of like you're reacting to the pain, or it's coming a little bit late. And I think, so what you find is that people that have health issues when they're really young have an extreme sense of gratitude and appreciation for having health. And so being sick early on in life leads to people having a stronger sense of responsibility and taking ownership of their health earlier on than the average person. I think ADHD kind of does the same thing. Because you have this disorder and this experience and this disadvantage that puts you in a position where you realize just how important it is to manage your motivation and your discipline. And sometimes people only learn the regret of not staying motivated and not taking risk and not being disciplined when they're 70 years old. It's very easy to watch your entire life go by you and never really go, shit, if only I spent a little bit more time working at this, if only I stayed more consistent towards this. So ADHD kind of forces you to acknowledge like the cost of time and the cost of discipline much earlier than the average person, because the issue's right in front of you. You've already seen how it can hurt you by the time you're 20 years old. So I think one thing it can really do is it can make people identify with the responsibility to take time and motivation and consistency and focus and all of the things that get hurt with ADHD more seriously. So that's one of the things that I think you can, I don't know if I would call that a superpower, but I would say that it's an advantage you can gain from taking responsibility that, ADHD provokes you to do in a way that it doesn't provoke as heavily in the average person.
Right. Why do you think there are such a wide range of experiences here? Like, do you think it's a general, I guess, quote unquote, ignorance to it or stigma? Like, why is it that there's such a wide range of identity crisis that kind of happens with ADHD?
Maybe this is a bit of a cop-out, but I think it's as easy as the fact that people are different, right? Like the variety in reactions to ADHD
I think that's a great answer. Yeah.
Yeah, is just as varied as the variation in people. So, what an identity means to somebody and how much they rely on it and what it does for them. And all of these things are so different from every individual. Like ADHD isn't the only identity that you can cling to, right? Yeah, ADHD is a very small part of your brain and who you are and your experiences. And so our job to create a sense of self and a sense of me is to try and put that all together into a single idea, right? And so ADHD is like an ingredient, right? Like you can put pepper in any dish, but whether you look at pepper as the thing that defines that dish is up to you. So what I think we have is a lot of people cooking different dishes and they're all identifying with this one ingredient. And so we think that ingredient, it must define the taste of this dish in some way. Well, no, it's an ingredient in the dish, right? But when we get caught in this conversation of, what does pepper do to a meal? Well, like it depends on the meal, right? Like it can make it a little bit spicier, but obviously spices complement different types of food in different types of ways. So that's maybe the analogy I would use.
I feel like that answers the question. I feel like that analogy in and of itself kind of answers the broad question here. I think putting it in that way, I know for me, it helps put it into a perspective that makes it very easy to understand for a lot of people, because, right, I mean, we all might be cooking the same thing, but how, like, the ingredients within it, the importance of each ingredient it might differ for each person. I think that's a really important point to point out. With that being said, I want to talk about like one specific set of people and then go to the other. First, the people that view their ADHD in a negative way, right? Do you think it's important for those people to reframe their struggles in a positive way, or would it be more, I mean, I know there's no one answer to this, but do you think it should be more helpful if they're just realistic with themselves and just kind of like accept it, or in what you were kind of alluding to, kind of just find a mix of both?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, but more so the second, because once you get God, the way that shame bullies us, man. Like once you get rid of the shame and the identification with ADHD as something that makes you inferior, like the whole world changes. I mean, who the hell isn't born with a disadvantage, right? Who the hell doesn't have at least one health condition? It could have been born in a better country, could have been, been friends. Like, we think about our access to education in school. Like so much of our opportunity, our health and life is just defined by resources in the basic social environment. Like the difference between, somebody who has an uncle who's like really wise and good with finances and the way that sets them up for success. Like you will kill yourself with grief if you sit and think about all the ways that life could have been better. And ADHD, if you take away the shame from it, is really a disadvantage like any other disadvantage, right? So if when you're looking at ADHD, a lot of people usually have at least one thing that they kind of can't suffer fools on. Like some people are like, oh, I was born poor. And then you'll find some people that came from poverty. Like that's not an excuse. You got to do it. Or some people that struggle with depression. It's like, that's not an excuse. Everybody has like you can solve this issue. And you shouldn't be attaching yourself to it. ADHD people should start looking at themselves in the same way, because it's our attachment to the issues that is way more debilitating than the issue itself in a lot of cases.
Right.
So I think that like an important thing to do is just to really detach yourself from the shame of it. And ADHD is just a disadvantage that you have to deal with. And that is so incredibly normal and human. Your disadvantage is ADHD. Someone else's disadvantage is that, they're born with a disability, right? Or they were born into poverty, or they got injured when they were younger, right? There's any number of disadvantages that we can attach ourselves to. ADHD is just one of them. It's not, it doesn't have to be who you are. It doesn't have to define you, right?
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of people in my audience that got a late diagnosis, including myself. So like I got my diagnosis when I'm 37 now. I got mine when I was like 34. And it kind of, the struggle that I had when I first was diagnosed was this woulda, coulda, shoulda, mindset that you were kind of talking about just now. But I feel as though my late diagnosis kind of helped shift my sense of self and my self-acceptance a little bit. For the people out there that are listening that are kind of maybe new to that are adults, maybe got a late diagnosis, that are new to the ADHD world, can you explain how no matter what you feel about it, whether it's a superpower or a weakness, however you feel about it, can you explain how just in general understanding ADHD can help you understand you, the person?
Yeah. Because all you have to do is look at the problems that's the great thing about a diagnosis is it just puts like a clear frame on your issues, right? So if you look at a symptom list and it says, okay, you struggle with attention, and then you look back in your life at all of the ways that having poor attention has harmed you, you realize that you were at a disadvantage, and that gives you a little bit more self-forgiveness. The other way that it helps you is that it empowers you to know what your issues are, because you can't solve a problem until you know what it is. Your attention like needs to be on the issue. We love putting, it's so helpful just in general, like just the basic cognition of putting problems in front of you visually or just vocally or whatever is just so useful. It's crazy. The example I always give, because it's a great example and it's also just fucking funny, is my mom building IKEA furniture. Because all she does is just for the entire 2 hours, she's just screaming about how annoying it is, right? And the reason we do that, like the reason why we've kind of evolved to pick up that habit, I think, is because when we externalize and vent about the stuff that is frustrating us, it's in front of us so we can guard against it, right? If an arrow is coming to hit you, you need to know what direction to hold your shield up in.
Yes.
And so, yeah, like putting the problem right in front of you, like it might seem like you're exacerbating it and making it worse, only focusing on the negative. But when you can focus on the negative, you can defy it more easily, right? So having a clear list of your symptoms makes it really easy to know where your shield needs to be pointed.
Yeah, I love that. And for the record, just to help your mom feel better, I also get it. I also get very upset at some of the things I have to build.
It's just her thing. Like the other day we said she only has two modes, which is happy and optimistic or aggressive. That's just who she is.
When I moved into my new home, I got all new stuff. And so like I had to put all of that together. And I was just like, why did I make this decision for me?
So she loves building it, but she needs aggression is her fuel source.
That's fair.
To get it done.
I'm glad that you talked about shame. I'm glad that you brought that word up, because there were people that did mention that in the comments, that mentioned shame. One of the comments that stood out to me, it said, I finally feel empowered to embrace what my brain offers, but it took years of unlearning shame. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with what you were talking about a couple minutes ago. How can ADHDers unlearn that self-criticism and start just embracing themselves?
I think that for me, so there's a lot of different ways that you can approach shame. I think with ADHD, because where ADHD really tends to hurt people is in their performance, because it's really measurable. In fact, like if you look at what diagnosis tests or screening tests, they're always focused about like kind of the way that it's reflected in achievements, right? Like a big one is academic performance. So a big one is, I think, trying to look at shame less so about a feeling. Like what I find works for people is to think about it less as a feeling and to think about more about what shame is as a behavior. And if you want to think about shame as a behavior, you can really easily do this. You just replace the word shame with hiding. Stop hiding.
Interesting.
Build a little bit of like physical behavioral evidence for yourself that, okay, I have ADHD and it makes me want to hide in this way, and I'm not going to hide like that anymore. Right. And I think that's a really important step for people because, you know, ADHD is this thing that makes you want to retreat and be invisible. It makes you want to not do things. It makes you want to hide. And so when it comes to unlearning the shame, one of the ways that you can unlearn something is just to teach it, is just to reinforce it through behavior. So saying, I want to hide from this, but I'm not going to, is like a really important step, because then it teaches you that ADHD isn't this thing that forces you to hide. You're making yourself hide because of your relationship with ADHD, right?
Right.
It's you who's deciding that these are problems that cut you out of opportunities or make you unworthy of the world.
Right.
And so, yeah, acting a little bit defiantly against shame, this like hiding tendency, I think is a really good way of realizing that it actually doesn't have to control you.
Right.
Because shame can very easily be this thing that we're supposed to feel ashamed. Like that's how we're supposed to feel. That's how we're supposed to think of ourselves. Right. But you can also just look at it as a behavior, and you can act against that behavior, which is to hide.
Right. Yeah. The question that that as I was doing research for this episode and reading through comments and just thinking in general, one of the questions that stood out to me, and this is, I don't know if there's an answer to this question without being hypothetical, right? But I want to ask it anyway, because I'm really curious your thoughts. If ADHD disappeared tomorrow, what aspects of it do you think people would actually miss?
That's a great question. Fuck. That's an awesome question.
I don't know if I have an answer to it. I think it might differ for each person, I guess, but like, if it were to go away, would there be anything from it that I actually missed?
Well, I actually love, because, we could look at the practical version of this question, which would be, how do people react? What objections do people have to taking medications? Because that's one that's very easy to look at and very easy to study, right? But the thing that makes that so challenging is that that's a decision that you have to make. Like, you have to wake up every morning and decide if you're going to take the medication or not. And sometimes people have these thoughts that do it. If you take it away, that option away from them, like, what would that change? That's such an interesting question. You're right. It's crazy hypothetical, but I want to try and think about it because it's so interesting. Like, what happens if you take away the option to neglect your ADHD management?
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's a fucking great question.
It's been on my mind ever since. And because like I was trying to fully understand just how much of my ADHD is my identity in like a true way, not like I drive an electric car and I make that my identity kind of joke kind of thing, but like, which I do, but like what kind, like how much of my ADHD is like legitimately a part of me. And if it were to go tomorrow, is there anything that I would just miss from it? And I don't know if I have an answer.
The one thing that stands out to me is that, and sometimes this is healthy, for the most part it's unhealthy, is that sometimes ADHD is permission to just kind of let go for a second. Like sometimes, because I've seen this a lot, people who are like, it's 7 p.m. and I feel like my meds are wearing off and I feel like, okay, it's late and my ADHD is really, starting to define my ability to focus because I don't focus as well later in the day. Right. And so it's just this excuse to just be like, okay, fuck it, I'm going to scroll on Instagram for the rest of the day. And like, I think that's something that's a little, like, actually, it can be a little beneficial. For the most part, though, it's this very easy excuse for you to access. But I think that would be missed, right? The ability to just kind of give up on yourself, because when you stop having this like relationship with managing your disorder in a way where you can decide that you can't manage it anymore, then kind of everything falls back on you. Right. So it gives you a little bit of like freedom from yourself. Again, like we go back to shame, right? Like this idea of giving yourself permission, which can be both beneficial and not beneficial at the same time. It's actually like really interesting. Like I read a couple of studies that I thought were really interesting where they basically talked about how giving yourself excuses could keep you motivated in some contexts, but in other contexts, it would keep you from it would stop you from ever making progress. Right. So there's like, again, it goes back to that thing I mentioned at the very beginning, which is like hypocrisy and lying to yourself a little bit. Sometimes it's actually really helpful to give ourselves excuses. And sometimes it stops us from making any kind of progress. Right. I think I like to think that any trait that exists in the brain usually was useful at some point. And that's why we evolved to keep it. And I think that that's a good example of that. Like, I think humans have the ability to make excuses for themselves for a reason. I don't think we evolved that ability for randomly. That's the one thing that I kind of think about when I think about what would we miss. We would miss the ability to excuse ourselves. In a way that can actually be healthy, honestly, and beneficial. Right. Even if in most cases, I think it's usually just an excuse.
Right. That you saying that actually, it reminds me of a video I saw once in which, the person said that my ADHD isn't an excuse; it's a reason. What do you think of that quote?
I'm a stickler for words, so it just makes you want to know, how are we defining reason, how are we defining excuse? Because I get the vibe a little bit. I do. Like it's a legitimate reason not to do something versus an excuse. But, that is such a morally judgmental thing. Like sometimes people think that they're like, because I work with motivation a lot. It's like one of the biggest topics I talk about ever. And a lot of people talk about, oh, I have no excuse, or it's just me I kind of talk them in the opposite direction of like, they say that they're just making excuses. And I say, no, these are actually reasons not to do it. Right. It's just about how we morally judge it and how we morally feel about it. So I get the vibe that they're going for there. And I think I kind of agree with it. But if a client said that to me, I would definitely kind of challenge them a little bit on it and be like, okay, like, let's see if we can find a better way to figure out how you're looking at when it's okay to do things and not okay to do things. Because like putting it all in the responsibility of 2 words can be really useful if we're extremely clear on what those words mean. And when this whole episode is reacting to comments where people had different interpretations of things. So like as people talk about this on the podcast, I wonder, how are people defining a reason when like they decide if they agree with that or not.
Right.
Yeah, that's the stickler in me. It's just like, because that's something that I do a lot in my practice, is like really challenging what people mean when they use words.
Yeah. Is ADHD an advantage or not?
Yeah. And we and I'm saying that so simply because we already have this whole context to back it up. But
that's
you know,
why that's why I asked it at the end.
yeah, perfect. Yeah, really great way to ask, right? But yeah, just to sum it up now. Maybe it leads to advantages. You know, we talked about all that already. So I'll just you know, in a nutshell, no. But
fair.
that doesn't mean that you are at a disadvantage in life, and it doesn't mean that you don't have advantages yourself. It doesn't mean that you don't have strengths. But yeah.
Is there anything else that you feel people should understand about this topic?
Yeah, I think I do. I think I want to mention how, because you know what you talk about, you mention a lot is you mention how I'm a late diagnosis as an adult, right? And it's really interesting to see the difference in people how easy it is to go your whole life not realizing that you have this crazy disadvantage. Right. And then on the other side of the fence are people talking about how it's very clear to them that this is an advantage they have in life. Like for some people, and it's not because one group is stupid and one group isn't, right? It's just that, you know, we tend to repackage ideas once we get more familiar with them as well. So it's just interesting how adults can go through life not knowing they have ADHD, and then other people go through life so aware of the fact that their ADHD has given them strengths. So I think that it's just worth pointing out that we notice very small differences. Like maybe this is a bad thing to do for a podcast, but for people, if you end up clipping this, or for anybody who watches the video, like if I have these two sheets of paper and they're like mostly the same, and then I fold the corner like this, and I ask you to point out which one is on the right and which one is on the left, you're going to say the folded corner one. So even though they're 99% of the same, you define this one based on its very slight difference. Right. And so you know, we notice differences a lot. And when we notice them, it can be really, really extreme. And when we don't notice them, they don't have any definition over how we look at ourselves. So I think that's like a good question to ask people who talk about how they know that their superpowers come from ADHD, or they know that their disadvantages come from ADHD. It's like a good way to challenge them would be, how do you explain people that go their whole lives without knowing it? Like I know some people who don't even realize they have ADHD until they're 60, even though they've heard the term over and over and over again. Sometimes they've helped people with ADHD, right? Sometimes they have like nieces or children that have ADHD and they never think to apply it to themselves, right? So I think that's I want to end on that challenge of like how do you compare that to people that can't identify it versus you who can? How do you know it's who you are? And if you have a confident answer to that question, run with it. But I think that every opinion you own is better if you've tested it.
I think that's fair. I think that's totally fair. Justin, you're dropping knowledge today, my friend. That's what I knew. I'm like, I had to have you back, and I'll happily have you back again. And if any of you are listening right now and you're like, wait, I like this guy, I want to learn more, I'm going to include a link to Justin's behavioral awareness coaching. It's called Solilium, and it is going to be in the links down below. And if people want to reach out to you, what can you provide for them?
Just in terms of what can I provide with coaching? Yeah, just basically self-improvement. Like, you know, I don't come with this idea of, I have this 5-step method that gets you where you want to be. I'm a guy that knows the psychology that's going to craft a tailored plan for you, because generic results get generic solutions. So for me, it's all about that's why I call it behavioral awareness, because it's all about promoting individual knowledge, individual insight, individual strategies. It can be about ADHD. It can be about confidence. It can be about motivation and discipline. It can be I can support mental health in a more action-oriented way than a more, you know, controlled environment for it, like therapy sometimes. Like some people get a lot out of that. Yeah, just anything in the realm of self-improvement that you want to pick the brain of someone who, you know, knows the psychology, that's me. I make it easy. You can just get to know me with a 20-minute consultation for free. So you don't have to try and sort out the mess yourself through all the paragraphs on my website if you don't.
Right. I know you're based in Canada. Is good for anybody in the northern hemisphere, or is it just Canada?
Yeah, I work with people all over. Obviously mostly Canada and North America, in America, just because of the time, the time zone issues. But yeah, I'm happy to work with anyone across the world.
Great, awesome, cool. Yeah, anybody that's listening right now that wants to get that 20-minute free consultation with Justin, I'm going to include that information in the description of this podcast. Justin, thank you so much. Thank you again for coming back. You know, you're stuck with me now, bro. You gotta come back. You know, we gotta talk some more, because there's plenty of topics that I know I can pick your brain on. And I know that the audience will get a lot out of. So I appreciate you taking time out of your day to sit and speak with me again. To everybody listening and everybody watching, thank you so much. I hope you got something out of this, because this is good stuff that we're talking about here.
And that's a wrap on this week's episode of the Vibe with Kai podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you found a little bit of comfort in today's episode, and I hope that you're walking away with a little bit of encouragement, and I hope that you laughed a little bit along the way. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like and subscribe and leave a review. Let me know what you thought of the episode. I really want to hear your voice. I want to hear your story. I want to hear all about your journey Let's keep the conversation going. Make sure you follow me on all of your favorite social media platforms. Follow me on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, whatever it may be, at The Vibe with Kai for more tips, more laughs, and more real talk. Remember, my friends, you are not alone on this journey. We are in this together. And until next time, stay kind to yourself, embrace the journey, and keep vibing. I'll catch you next time. Much love. Good vibes.